In the midst of all these recent outcries to have any statue of any figure that had anything to do with racial oppression in America, like Confederate leaders or slave owners and so forth, in the midst of these outcries, I've heard of at least one commentator who's also called for the elimination of any depictions of Jesus as a white man. According to this commentator, not only is the depiction of Jesus as a lily white man not accurate historically, that's not actually how he looked, but it also helps to perpetuate racism. I don't know whether or not depictions of Jesus as a white man perpetuate racial oppression. I'll leave that to others to debate. But the historical question is a pretty straightforward question. What color was Jesus? What did he look like? What complexion did he have? That's a pretty simple and straightforward question to answer. We know that in Jesus' day, Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jew. Amongst first century Palestinian Jews, over 99% of the population had a typically Semitic look. Less than 1% was a pale white, a very, very pale white with a fiery red hair, fiery red kind of complexion. But the vast majority, and that means the overwhelming probability, is that Jesus had a Semitic look. So he was neither white nor black. He looked more like somebody in our culture who has a Hispanic background. In fact, one of the best depictions of Jesus' skin tone I've ever come across is this picture of him right here. This comes as close as I've seen in depictions of Jesus to what his actual skin tone really looked like. What else can we say about Jesus' appearance? Not much. We would love to have a picture of him. We would love to know what he looked like. The famous poet, historian, and writer Thomas Carlyle once remarked that even though he was a man of meager means, at least according to him, he would have given up a third of his fortune to have a physical description of Jesus. Then he would have had somebody make that into a statue, a figure, and he would have the most precious heirloom, he said, of all the ages. We would love to know what Jesus looked like. But the Gospels are absolutely silent about that. There's not even one verse, one half of a verse, that tells us anything about his physical appearance. We can guess, based on what we know about first century Palestine, that Jesus wore his hair long and had a beard and mustache. We can guess that because the Gospels tell us Jesus was itinerant. He traveled around a lot, that he was fairly fit, pretty fit. We can tell because the diet back then was limited. It wasn't that substantial, that he was probably very thin as well, perhaps even looking a little emaciated. But beyond that, we have no idea what he looked like. In fact, I think that's by design. I think the reason the Gospels don't tell us anything about his physical appearance is intentional, because that's not important. What matters isn't his physical appearance, but his character, who he is. And they tell us a lot about who he is. They tell us that he had a personality that was absolutely magnetic. He may have been one of those people that when they look at you, they can stare right into your soul. We know they had a great sense of humor. We usually don't get his humor because we're not first century Palestinian Jews and we don't speak in an Aramaic idiom. But what Jesus says in the Gospels in many places is very humorous. It's really funny, hysterical in some cases. We know that Jesus embodied, not just taught, but embodied this breathtaking love, a love which arguably no other human being has ever risen to. And that even though some of what he did offended people, especially the religious leaders, deeply, for the most part, he captivated people with his breathtaking love, with crossing boundaries, with being so radically inclusive. So we know a lot about Jesus' character. The Gospels are chock full with stories, with a narrative that fleshes out who he was. And the reason they focus on that, not his appearance, is because that tells us who God is. Jesus' character is the very character of God. When I was in college, a friend invited me to his African-American Catholic church for Mass one day. When I walked into the church, I saw this stunning, beautiful, gorgeous crucifix of an African-American Jesus. And during Mass, it occurred to me that crucifix for an African-American faith community of an African-American Jesus, that enabled them to connect more deeply, more intimately with him, which meant that they ultimately were enabled to connect more deeply with God. Then it dawned on me that in my faith community, which was primarily Irish Catholic, that the depictions that I saw all around me all the time, the ones that there were the pictures of the Sacred Heart where the heart is actually kind of protruding out of the chest. It's kind of grotesque actually when you think about it. But Jesus was always depicted as being lily white with kind of very light brownish hair. That my faith community depicted Jesus that way for the same reason, to feel a deeper, more intimate connection with him, and therefore a more intimate connection with God. And that may not be all bad. That, despite some of the excesses and some of the ways it can lead to feelings of racial superiority, if we recognize that people can depict Jesus in many different ways according to their own color as a way of feeling a deeper connection with him, if we recognize that diversity, it reminds us that he's a transcendent being, that he transcends all human distinctions. It reminds us that he's the creator of all of us. He created us in all our wondrous diversity. It reminds us that he wants us to love each other the way he loves each and every one of us, regardless of our color. And most of all, it enables us to have that deeper connection with him so that he can draw us into his perfect, breathtaking love, a love which not only fills us to overflowing, is the best thing ever, better than life itself, but a love which also enables us to love each and every person, to cherish and celebrate all the differences in each other that we see around us, and find a unity with one another in him, a unity which is perfect and complete. So, how do you think Jesus looked? And do you think it matters how people depict Jesus today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can go to the Contact DJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave them there. Regardless of how you picture Jesus, I pray that you will be drawn into that deeper, more intimate connection with him so that you will know his perfect, breathtaking love.